Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Gerson Martinez. Now, Gerson and I have connected. I connected with him about a year ago because we share a lot of similar backgrounds in the nonprofit world and a lot of our shared values, and just really connected with him as an early person that attracted me to wanting to do more in the Bitcoin space and contribute more with my voice and with any way that I can help and assist this growing community. Now, this episode, honestly, I knew I would enjoy chatting with him, and really excited to bring this episode to you all as well. We talk a lot about El Salvador. We talk about some mining stuff and nonprofit work, and really his story. And his story is really unique and interesting, and I wanted to make sure to try to amplify this. So his family and his in-laws as well both come from El Salvador. Now, he was born in the States, but his family is from El Salvador, and he's been going back regularly to El Salvador. So we get into all the history of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, Bitcoin adoption, all of this stuff in regards to El Salvador, because I think there's too much of a media narrative about El Salvador that makes it seem very black and white, in US media in particular, that has nothing to do with locals on the ground. So I wanted to be sure to try to amplify this message and have a conversation around this as well. So some folks might listen to this and possibly disagree with the conversation, or think that we should have gone into more detail about other things. But really, I just wanted to get his views and his experience in talking about amplifying messages from people on the ground in El Salvador. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of people's lives are getting better in El Salvador. And I wanted to highlight that because the people of El Salvador are incredible. In any way that we can highlight that and highlight businesses and nonprofits that are doing incredible work in El Salvador around Bitcoin and so many other things, we want to amplify those messages. So again, hope you enjoyed this episode. Either way, you can send me an email at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. Hope to hear from you all if you have any thoughts on this episode. And be sure to support the work and the links that I've put in the bottom of the show notes as well to support the work of Bitcoiners in El Salvador and the people of El Salvador. All right, I'll let you get to the episode, and we'll see you again next week. Hey, Gerson, how's it going, man?
Hey, man, it's going well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm super excited to have you on the podcast.
Awesome.
And I want to give people a backstory too. There were a few people in the space, and you're one of them, that I think I was able to connect with on like similar backgrounds, similar shared interests, and showed me, I kind of want to do more in this space. And you were one of those guys. So I'm super appreciative of, just the time and energy you gave to me to talking with me. And for folks that didn't know, I've kind of mentioned it here before and in other places, with my nonprofit background. I was trying to figure out ways to tie Bitcoin into that. And I'm still passionate about that, but then found more of a voice kind of focusing on these efforts that we're doing here with the Progressive Bitcoiner and things like that. But before I jump in too much, do you want to give people who might not know who you are a little bit of background, a little bit of context?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Gerson Martinez. I'm the son of two Salvadoran immigrants to the United States. So my parents were born in El Salvador, and they moved to the States about 40 years ago during the Civil War period in El Salvador. So I was born in the U.S. I was born in Maryland. And I spent actually some of my formative years, even though I was born over there, I spent some of my formative years here in El Salvador. Precisely because of some of the really high barriers to success for immigrants in America. My parents had to send me back to their country of origin so that they could keep their jobs in America, and therefore get their green cards, get eventually their citizenships. So I spent my first 3.5 years here in El Salvador. So even though I was born over there, and then of course went back to the States, grew up, the rest of my childhood over there. So I went to public school in Maryland. I went to the University of Maryland to study math and economics. And then I embarked on a career, and kind of the area of interest for me at the time was capital markets. I mean, I guess I should say it always has been. I've always been intrigued by capital markets. I went into a career directly into an investment bank, a bulge bracket firm in New York. I had this great fortune, blessing, to end up in this in this industry that really isn't accessible to a lot of folks, kids of immigrants, and stuff like that. So at that point in my life, if you were to ask my parents, they felt like I had already kind of won the lottery, right? In terms of getting an education in America. My dad, what he used to tell me is like, if you can work in an air conditioned building with a keyboard in front of you, you've already won. That
Yeah.
was basically the viewpoint,
Yeah.
for him. He's like, I hope you don't have to work as hard as I do with my
Mm.
hands outside, that kind of thing. So, my career, my training and my education, and then my first career was in capital markets. But I very quickly, I think, fell out of love with that industry on a personal level in terms of what it demanded of you, just complete devotion. There was this almost this adage, this saying in the industry. It's like, when your personal life starts to fall apart, that's when you know you're doing a good job at work.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
like, and people would joke about that, but be serious, right? At the same
Hmm.
time. And I'm like, I don't want that. I don't
Hmm.
care how, I don't care what the paychecks look like, or what the, whatever the image of it all looks like. That's not the life that I want. So it
Mm.
took me some years to figure that out and figure out what I would do with my life post, that industry. So after about 5.5 years, I did leave. I had to worked up the guts to leave and then say, what up? What do I do now? And to make a long story short, this is where kind of nonprofit work entered my life. I had to this point, I had never once considered, work that is for the greater good, or
Mm.
social good. But my wife is an educator, and I followed her into originally the education space. I joined a charter school. I joined the founding team of a charter school in New York. I was their finance and analytics guy because that's what I could do. I can't teach, and I'm not great, around children. But anyway, I joined a founding team of a charter school, and I got, for the first time in my life, I got a particular experience, which was to insert myself to become part of a community in America, right? And this was in the South Bronx, that
Mm.
was structurally like disadvantages doesn't do, that word
Hmm.
doesn't do it justice, right? These people were, structurally captive, in their zip code. There was very, very
Yeah.
little way for them to make it out of their zip code. Education, of course, is one of those ways in which to do it. So this was for the first time. It was like kind of like the curtains were opening for me to understand just how lucky I had been to have been born in the, zip code that I was born in rural
Mm.
Maryland, instead of, in particular in the South Bronx, where these kids were faced with a lot of dangers, etc. So anyway, we spent 3 years kind of helping to build up this charter school, which is still in existence today. By the way, the school is now in its like 11th or 12th year. It serves
Mm.
over 1,000 families in New York. So we are
That's
very,
awesome.
very fortunate to be a part of this founding team of this highly effective, public school. In 2016, we decided to move from New York back to Maryland, where I'm from. We had had our first daughter. It was, purely family, personal reasons that we decided to leave New York. I continued my journey in nonprofit work because I fundamentally did believe that this was the way that I could use my advantages, my, all of the stuff that I had been given through no credit of my own, to give back, to build up, to leave the world in a little bit of better place than I had found it. So I joined a nonprofit in my hometown as its executive director, a mentoring organization. And this organization provided after school, kind of enrichment activities, as well as mentorship for kids. So again, this is all kind of in the realm of seeing nonprofit work as the best thing that I could do professionally, with myself, to have purpose in my life. I happen to come from a family, a Christian, family full of ministers. I did not ever feel a calling in that direction, to enter,
Hmm.
ministry. So I thought this is the other way that I might be able to make a positive impact in the world. So that's what kind of led me to the nonprofit space, originally, leaving capital markets, going into education, and then finally leading a nonprofit in my hometown. And then along that path, I, of course, matured a lot. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself. I learned, and I got my education. I began my education in Bitcoin, through this time, and I have to say, Bitcoin really started to help me reframe what what the solutions are to the root issues, right? That I was
Hmm.
out there trying to fix, or trying to solve, not fix, but trying to be a part of the solution too.
Yeah.
So, and we can jump into that at whatever point you want, but yeah, that's a little bit of the trajectory for me.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's I mean the break you probably told me this story almost a year ago now when we first connected,
Mhm.
and one of the reasons I'm really interested to talk to you as well, and I think for our audience, which I've mentioned before, is right now our audience are progressive Bitcoiners, right?
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
inevitably what will happen is, for better or for worse, bear market comes, people get more curious, right?
Mhm.
About Bitcoin, maybe seeing progressive and Bitcoiner together, kind of scratching their heads, trying to figure out what that can mean and could imply. And one of the things you just described, a lot of different factors that I want to talk to you about, right? You and I have had some interesting conversations about what Bitcoin can do for the nonprofit space that just has
Yeah.
not been tapped into yet, which I want to
Mhm.
discuss. But
Mhm.
also your background, kind of having your feet in two different worlds in a unique way, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
Bitcoiners that are really interested in El Salvador right now.
Mhm.
And then there's Bitcoiners like yourself who are interested in El Salvador because that's where your family's from. And
Mhm.
also, it happens to be Bitcoin country now, which is great.
Exactly.
But you have a
Yeah.
unique perspective when so many people are seeing so many different headlines about El Salvador that
Yep.
I have personally messaged you about, being like, what do you make of all this?
Yep. Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about that as well, because it's super complicated.
Yeah.
And there could be things, just for folks listening, that they hear from your perspective that they might disagree with, or something like that, right? But what I'm asking is, like, talking with you, like, your family, this is your home, right? This is your
Yeah.
family's home, and this
Yeah.
is the perspective you're approaching it, not some high
Mhm.
level, um, moral high ground. Let's put it that
Exactly.
way, with some of the
Yeah.
things that might be talked about. And I think people need to understand that. So it doesn't mean
Mhm.
if I say something about it or you do, that that's the end all be all, right? But it means that I want
Of
to
course.
have complex conversations about this place that is complicated and complex.
Absolutely.
And that's what Bitcoin is about too. We talk about things that are complex, and sometimes people like to simplify it. So I'm really excited to talk with you about all of that.
Yeah, man.
And this is our first recording for folks listening with someone. You're at Bitcoin Beach right now. You're
I
doing a
am.
recording there. And for folks listening, I want to have more conversations with Salvadorians, and we've been having a lot of conversations with some awesome African Bitcoiners. So we're
Mhm.
making our way through, and
Yeah.
hopefully at some point, I'd love to just get down there and do some live in
Absolutely.
person conversations, which we'll have to
Definitely.
do. But first of all, can you talk to people about maybe we just start there? Being at Bitcoin Beach,
Mhm.
you and your family, you regularly go down there. You guys are on
Mhm.
vacation right now.
Yeah.
Hope the family's doing good and having fun.
They are.
But can you
Yeah.
talk to people about Bitcoin Beach, for those that,
Yeah.
like, maybe they've seen stuff here and there about it, but what's it like down there, and what are some of the things that you've been doing while you're there?
Sure, sure, yeah. So Bitcoin Beach, first of all, is that's what we Bitcoiners call it colloquially. The name of the town is El Zonte. It's a beach town. This part of El Salvador along the coast is littered or not to say littered, but there's a ton of tiny little villages. Seaside villages that focus on fishing and surfing effectively, and tourism, and there's one after the other. El Sonte happens to be the town where Bitcoin became an experiment that was tried by at this point I think a lot of folks know Mike Peterson, Roman Martinez, Jorge Valenzuela. These are
Mhm.
folks. Jorge and Roman are local young leaders in their community who do, by the way, nonprofit work. They've been doing nonprofit youth development work for 15 years here. Because 15 years ago, El Salvador had very little
Yeah.
opportunity for kids in this community. So what I think is important for your audience to take away is
Hmm.
that El Zonte, before it was called Bitcoin Beach, was a community that had its perspective and its eyes on the future, and were effectuating and were executing on that vision through youth development work. In the US we have
Yeah.
501c3s. We would call that nonprofit work, but here it was just Roman and Jorge every other day taking the kids out to the beach, playing games with them, organizing, litter removal, teaching surfing lessons. This was all happening
Hmm.
before Bitcoin, right? So it's not that like
Yeah.
suddenly everybody wants to. No, no. These folks have cared about the well being of their young people in their community through nonprofit work, and have done so through nonprofit work for a long time. Now along came Mike Peterson, who is a surfer, by the way. He visited it something like over 20 years ago, and he made this his
Hmm.
home. But he was the conduit through which Bitcoin arrived here. And over the course of a handful of years, Bitcoin was effectively injected into the community, and it was
Hmm.
made into the effort was to create a circular economy here for vendors and people to be able to transact with each other in this digital currency. So they've been and they continue to be on
Hmm.
this journey of education, like door to door, neighborhood to neighborhood education, really grassroots education on Bitcoin, which to me is commendable because I don't see that anywhere in the States. Right? We have a bunch of people with
Yeah.
opinions and Twitter accounts, but very few people doing the ground level work that these folks are doing. And I have tremendous respect, for the folks that are here. Now, when you visit, and I recommend that everybody does, this is a beautiful, absolutely beautiful landscape. Absolutely beautiful town, full of surfers. It's a complete
Hmm.
like surfer town, right? No one wears shoes. It's very, very casual. There's a diversity, an incredible diversity of people, right? Local folks as well as foreigners, of course, who come visit to surf. I would say at this point in the Bitcoin cycle, you're going to see way less like, let's call it Bitcoin tourists who come to do
Hmm.
the pilgrimage, to Bitcoin Beach, and way more just pure surfers who are here to spend a week uninterrupted, waves, and then maybe go back home. But it's a place
Hmm.
that my family and I, now consider a second home. Like it's a very small community, very very small community. Everybody knows each other's names,
Hmm.
and that's one of the beauties of it, right? Coming from this gigantic country with 300 million people or whatnot, it's really nice to be a part of a
Yeah.
really small community.
And I want people to know that too. Like even just following you, doing my own research for when I'm like, oh, when I want my wife and I to go down there. Like not only like, I said Bitcoin Beach because people know of it like that, but I'm glad you're pointing out in all of these small communities where Bitcoin's starting to
Hmm.
thrive, whether
Hmm.
it's El Salvador, Botswana, Togo, like whatever
Hmm.
locations we're talking about, where communities are transforming. People were
Yep.
doing this work beforehand. It's just that Bitcoin is now a better tool to do some of that
Exactly.
stuff that was already
That
being done. So that's
that's
really
exactly
exciting and
right.
really awesome. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also if people were to follow you on Twitter, which I recommend they do, you're just posting the most beautiful pictures of this beach of El Salvador. Like I show my wife all the time. I'm like, gosh, like Gerson's down at like the beach again, and like he's got his
Yeah.
coffee, and like it just looks so beautiful. Like I talk about it all the time,
And
just
can I
sitting in our
actually
apartment, which is so funny.
can I share something about that? And I think that a lot of folks who are here physically, like full time now, because a lot of people have moved here full time from Canada, from the U.S., wherever, right? I think part of the
Mhm.
motivation of doing so is this. Well, it's twofold. On the one hand, it's if you're an American or a Western, a Western person, and you've become accustomed to this life that is measured in like units of busyness, like how busy, first thing
Mhm.
somebody asks you in America, hey, how's it going? Busy as always. It's like a badge of honor, to
Sure. Yeah.
describe how busy and stressed out and important you are.
Mhm.
You come to a
Yeah.
place like this, and nothing matters but the ocean, the people around
Yeah.
you, and like the food in front of you, right? And that
Yeah.
is such it's such a a cleansing experience, I think, for in
Hmm.
particular, like I said, the folks that come from these busy, cities or places in other parts of the world, to come here and just
Yeah.
like literally ground yourself, right? No shoes and just touch the sand and touch the earth.
Hmm.
That to me is one of the most kind of magical and compelling, aspects of El Sonte, and it's what makes me a person who's lived most of my entire life in the U.S. want to be here, not on vacation only, but to want to start to live more of my
Hmm.
life here.
And what is it like? Do you notice any shifts in terms of your kids like hanging out there versus hanging out in Maryland or whatever? What are your kids and family think about it as well?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, my kids are a huge part of the reason why I want to be connected to this country and to this community in particular, but let's say
Mm,
to the country in general. Because let me tell you something. When I was growing up in America, in rural Maryland, in the 1980s and 1990s, my experience with being the son of an immigrant, right? The son of immigrants,
mm,
who could barely speak English, and could barely get by in America in the early years, was really
mhm,
difficult, and it was difficult in the kind of like psychological and emotional sense, right? I was bullied a lot, for being different, right? Because everybody considered me Mexican, first of all, because no one knew what El Salvador was, and I had all
yeah,
these kind of negative experiences, and what it did to me in my early years was actually make me resent my my cultural kind of identity, right, and my
yeah,
heritage. It,
mhm,
it made me want to distance myself from it, and I do not want my daughters to have that experience at all. I want them to be proud of their
mm,
roots. I want them to understand where their grandparents came from, right? And
yeah,
the real reasons why they had to leave, right? Not the surface level stuff, but like the deeply rooted, geopolitical stuff that caused
yeah,
people like my parents to have to leave. So I want my kids to not only just be comfortable here, comfortable with the language, comfortable with the culture, but to be proud of it, to represent it, as they grow up
mm.
and become part of communities in different parts of the world.
That's awesome, and it's kind of a good segue too because I know you've just been kind of putting out really just beautiful messages too, and I also want to amplify what you've talked about for your parents. And so I mean we could spend a whole series, a whole whatever this whole year every
Yeah.
day talking about the history of El Salvador and trying to
Mhm.
unpack this. But very simply put, El Salvador was a very dangerous place and it's improving in terms of that. And
Yeah.
you've talked about like while your parents getting to see this or your
Mhm.
both sets of parents in your
Yep.
family and so many
Mhm.
others have talked about that as well. They're different
Mhm.
generations and have seen so many beautiful videos of people coming back to El
Yep.
Salvador for the first time in 20 years and just
Mhm.
being amazed and surprised. And again,
Mhm.
we can also unpack or talk about how that was, how this what made this happen, and all these other things. But what has that been like for your family
Yep.
to witness this transformation? What have their thoughts been? Has there been specific thoughts around Bitcoin, or is it mainly just like, wow, this is amazing that this place has improved? What have those conversations been like, and what has that been like for your parents?
So as I mentioned, my parents left, and my in-laws as well. My father-in-law is from El Salvador. They all left when they were
Mm,
teenagers in the middle of a civil war. So this was not out of
yeah.
like ambition, or this was out of survival, right?
Hmm.
You're leaving a,
Yeah.
a dangerous country because as a young man in El Salvador in the 1980s, you had two choices as you walked out the door. You either eventually join the guerrilla, forces that were fighting against
Hmm.
the government forces, or you join the government forces. There's really no
Yeah.
neutrality, very little opportunity for neutrality. Anyway, our parents left during that season of El Salvador. And when they left with absolutely no desire to look back because their country was broken, right?
Hmm.
And as much as they miss their family, and of course there's a connection and a pride deep within. What happens? You get to America and you get thrown into the melting pot, and you get told you're American now.
Hmm.
Speak English. Remove that from yourself, right? Like you're now
Hmm.
here. Especially once you get the passport, you literally can't. Like you have to like effectively resign to your other citizenship once you become American. So
Yeah.
you get sucked into the melting pot of America. And for my entire upbringing, my parents never, well, I shouldn't say never. We came here on occasion, but it was specifically to see our family members. We would go and we would drive 4 days from Maryland to here.
Oh wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and we would drive and go directly to our families' homes, shut the door, and not leave because the country was very
Hmm.
dangerous. So my
Yep.
concept and my parents' concept of their country for 30 years was that it's dangerous and it's a place to escape from, right? Um,
Hmm.
and that's what it was. During the Civil War, during the time of a lot of gang proliferation here, which I think I would appreciate getting into that history because I think your audience
Yeah.
would appreciate it. But
Hmm.
during those periods, El Salvador was not a place to come to. It was a place to escape from. And that like sits deep
Yeah.
inside of you. That starts to get internalized, right? You start to, like I said, I
Hmm.
started to reject, my cultural heritage. And what has
Hmm.
happened
Yeah.
in a very, very short amount of time is on the ground here, like in real, like specific terms, the country has become it has gone from being controlled by let me be clear, these are not drug kingpin organizations. These are poor people extorting and killing other poor people out of poverty, out of the
Hmm.
need to eat, So it's gone
Yeah.
from a country that is wildly dangerous to one that is utterly safe. And I don't mean to say, and obviously not in America either. There are still, of course, events of violence. There is still, homicides and things like this. But the frequency with
Hmm.
which those happen is unbelievably low now. There's been a paradigm shift in
Yeah.
El Salvador in the last 3 years, and it's begun with um, the security issue, the safety issue for Salvadorans first. The average everyday Salvadoran, for example, the Salvadoran business owner no longer has to pay an extortion tax to his local gang member, which for 30 years he did. And then, of course, the second order
Yeah.
effect of that is that folks who are not from El Salvador now come here and come back because they know it's safe.
Hmm.
And that starts a flywheel effect
Right.
of investment, of
Hmm.
tourism, of consumption in the country, of production in the country. So that shift, I would say, has happened only in the last 3 years. Um, because
Hmm.
there was a even politically there was a big kind of tectonic shift in El Salvador. Can I describe that really quickly, just for your
Yeah,
audience's sake?
absolutely. I mean, I think we
Okay.
should take the majority of this episode to unpack some of this because
Yeah.
I don't think it happens enough. So
Hmm.
please, yeah.
So political history of El Salvador is really interesting. Um, During that period of civil war in El Salvador, there was basically the reason for the civil war had a lot to do with um, a bifurcated, economy. You had the elites, a handful of families in El Salvador that controlled basically every industry, and a government that protected that oligopoly. um,
Hmm.
then, of course, there was an uprising, as there always, if you've ever read a book about history, these things happen cyclically, right? You have
Hmm.
the uprising of the poor folks who come to want to topple, the power structure. So this was the origin of the Salvadoran Civil War. It raged for 12 years, 12, 13 years. Finally, there was a truce called. And at the moment of calling the truce, what ended up happening was that the folks who were fighting, the guerrilla forces who were fighting against, the government forces, were basically brought to the political table. So they called a truce, an armistice, right? No more firing guns. And they said, okay, you folks, you're now at the table. We will form, there will be a political party formed called the FMLN, um, which
Hmm.
now represented the left leaning party in the country, and the right leaning party called Arena, which is our the Americans version of Republican, right? This is your Republican
Hmm.
and Democratic parties, were thus established at the end of the Civil War. And for the last 30 years, since the end of the Civil War, which is in the early 90s, what's happened? Same thing as America. The political balance bounces back and forth, right? It goes from left FMLN president to Arena president to FMLN to Arena. You bounce back and forth. You have a two-party system. And what happens? The elites continually get protected and protected by either side. And then the normal people of the country, the regular, Joes in the country, continually get left behind, right? So this is not unlike,
Hmm.
what's happening in the States. It just, has happened to a more extreme degree in this country. Um,
Yeah.
in 2019, finally there was like I said, a tectonic shift in the political situation in El Salvador through the creation of a new party called the New Ideas Party, Nuevas Ideas, under the leadership of Nayib Bukele, who's now president of course, of El Salvador. He first became mayor of San Salvador, and well, I'm sorry, he was mayor of a smaller a town first. Then he became mayor of San Salvador, and of course his popularity grew because he was delivering on his promises to people. And then he rose to the presidency. And now the current political reality in El Salvador is that El Salvador has a president from Nuevas Ideas, and they have also, shortly after the presidential elections, the Asamblea Legislativa, their Congress, basically power shifted as well. So the old left and right were were replaced by the New Ideas Party, who were in democratic and
Mm.
fair elections, won the majority, a supermajority in Congress, in one election cycle. So the political situation in El Salvador has really experienced a tectonic shift, and I think that's the reason why a lot of things are happening with a fast pace in El Salvador. I mean,
Hmm.
this is no surprise to anyone in a democracy as well, right? You have a supermajority in Congress, and you have a president of the same party. Things are going to happen quickly, right?
Hmm.
And
Yep.
this president has prioritized, security, right, for the country first. He made that a priority, and I think that's what you heard me describe a little bit ago about the safety of the country is a result of those, campaign trail promises, of way back in
Hmm.
2019. So from the your
Yep.
original question was, how does my family, how do we view this? And from a distance, from thousands of miles away, what everyone sees and what our family members and friends here can attest to is that the country is safe. Right, the country is no longer a place to be afraid to walk onto the wrong
Hmm.
street because you might not make it out back out of that street. Right, this is fundamentally true now, and now the country can build on top of that foundation of safety. You cannot build
Hmm.
a strong economy. You can't have financial sovereignty and build, build up your individuals, your families or your country on a foundation of danger and violence, that persists. So I think there's
Hmm.
really been a paradigm shift that we're now just beginning to see the results of.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think, obviously, starting there first, because a lot of the conversations that might happen in El Salvador, especially in the West, any media outlets, usually it's not from Salvadorians actually being present for these conversations or even being the ones putting out the publications for sure. And B, we don't have the same. Some communities in the U.S. might have context of what safety feels like. There's like, New York City, for instance, a place that you and I have both lived in and love as well. There's been so many different shifts there, and it's a very different situation. But it's one thing to talk about different policies and things like that for New York, or kind of discuss issues like homelessness or opioid use or drugs or this and that, or gang violence from a distance without being there. But if you're there, you forget about what is the appropriate left response, what is the appropriate right response, what am I supposed to talk about this. You're just like, man, something needs to change because it's dangerous, or I'm seeing this, or I'm seeing that. And like, oh, we really want to fix this. It's more of a, how do we fix this? Not like a political game.
It's emblematic of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? In America, if you have all your
Yes.
basic needs met, you can then release yourself to postulate and debate about, what the proper political response is to a certain issue, because you
Sure.
yourself aren't worried about
Sure.
your basic needs anymore. But in El Salvador,
Yep.
when for 30 years you were worried about your physical safety. And let me give you a couple examples, by the way, of and your
Hmm.
audience, a couple of examples of what I mean by this. After the Civil War ended, so first there's like a hot, military, guns blazing sort of war. When that ended, the
Hmm.
reason that gangs began proliferating in El Salvador was actually is a problem born in the U.S. In L.A. In the 1980s, there were a lot of immigrants, right? Now, a lot of Salvadoran immigrants who had escaped this country and started to band together into gangs
Hmm.
in L.A. to protect each other, right? As gangs do. That's like kind of the origins of gangs often, right? Is to protect each other. Um, During the Clinton administration, when these folks started to, become violent and commit crimes in LA, the position of the Clinton administration was to say, let's take these folks and deport them back to their country. The ones, who
Hmm.
were in the U.S. As undocumented. The solution was to send them back to their country of origin, El Salvador. So you had a season of
Yeah.
plane loads of now gang members, right? Criminal,
Hmm.
criminals, being sent to El Salvador who had never once seen a gang member, right? That's a purely
Yeah.
American concept up until that point. But now you had
Hmm.
thousands and thousands of folks coming down to El Salvador and creating, and proliferating. And this is how the kind of gang problem became an issue.
Not only was it Los Angeles, so I'm here in
Hmm.
the Boston area, as you know, and
Hmm.
there's different communities around the Boston area that are highly Salvadorian immigrant
Hmm.
population. Like Chelsea,
Yeah.
Mass, is one example where I want to say roughly 70% of residents have ties to El Salvador, about
Hmm.
85% are
Hmm.
Latino origin. And so the same thing happened with gangs there. There was a lot of deportation from Boston. I'm sure from Baltimore as well, from New York City.
Yep.
So it wasn't just I mean, LA is massive. So even that alone to El
Yep.
Salvador would have been a lot on any
Yeah.
nation. But this was nationwide across not just El Salvador, many others, but we're talking about El
Yeah.
Salvador as well. So it was happening from Boston as well,
It
in
was.
addition
Yeah.
to LA during that time. Yeah.
Sorry, I just I remembered where I was going with this, because what I want to do for your audience is give examples of why, what I mean by safety, by physical safety, right?
Safety.
um
Yes.
so
Yep.
so we had these gang members uh flown into El Salvador now as hardened criminals, and they, for about a decade plus, started to take command and control of their local neighborhoods. So, for example, if you were a
Hmm.
young man, 12, 13, 14 years old, and these are small, I'm talking about small communities, right? Everybody knows each other. This is not in the dead center of San Salvador necessarily, right? This is all over El Salvador,
Hmm.
in tiny communities. If you're a young man, you may be expected to join the local kind of, gang effort, the gang
Hmm.
community, right? And as your audience might know, that's not oftentimes like a, hey, would you like to? It's more like,
Yeah.
you're
Come
you're
join our book
gonna
club.
join.
Yeah.
Right, and if you don't,
Yeah.
there's consequences for your family, right? So there's that dynamic.
Hmm.
If you're
Hmm.
a young woman, let's say you're the sister of that young man, a local gang member might say, "You're now my girlfriend," and he's not asking her out. He's
Yeah.
saying, "You are with me, and if you're not, if you resist,
Hmm.
there's consequences for your family." Right?
Yeah.
There's the third issue, that the gang member knows that this family has a family member in the states, and he says,
Hmm.
"You're gonna when you get money, I get money." Right? There's an element of
Yeah.
extortion, right? Um, and then maybe the father in this family has a small business, and there's an absolutely a tax that's applied
Mhm.
every first Monday of the month, you pay the gang member for protection, but it's not really protection. Of course, it's extortion, right? So these
Mhm.
are the
Mhm.
ways in which I think so many families were persecuted and extorted and tormented, by the gang members. And of course, there's an infinite amount, but I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of a sense of why people might want to leave this country, right? When that's your
Yeah.
reality and you can't leave your neighborhood. It's not like, oh, I'm going to move to another city. That's not a thing here for a lot of folks,
Mhm.
right? There's not the
Yeah.
resources for that. So your only way may be to send your children to the States, or you yourself go to the States to mitigate some of these risks. So I just kind of wanted to,
Yeah.
make sure that your audience gets a little bit of a sense for like what I mean by safety, right? When
Yeah.
that was your reality for 30 years, you're not really going to postulate and debate the politics of how you got to safety. You're
For sure.
happy that you are safe now.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that context, and again, for folks listening, if you're interested in listening to conversations where I want to be have debate with a guest on these topics or this and that. Like I'm talking with you because I want to hear your experience of this, your family's experience, and have people understand a side of things when they're seeing report, whether you're a Bitcoiner or not,
Mm,
reports in the New York Times talking about how terrible for democracy Nayib Bukele is.
yeah.
So these are things like I don't want to debate
Hmm.
what is democratic or not in this conversation for folks
Right.
that are listening. And if
Yeah.
folks can give me feedback and stuff. I say that at the intro to every episode, give them my email
Hmm.
and they can reach out. But I want to provide some alternative sources to this.
Right.
About these really deep and real things, especially for the left, right? And so, from the left, from this podcast, a lot of folks on the left are seeing New York Times post, different articles against Bitcoin, against, whatever, and they've done the same thing with El Salvador, whether it's because of Bitcoin or whether it's because of Bukele and others' handling of these real life things on the ground. So,
Yeah.
I guess I will jump into that with you though, in terms of some of these conversations and just these headlines that us in the West are seeing from, for lack of better terms, points of privilege, not on the ground
Hmm.
there, things like that. And I plan on having other conversations with other Salvadorians on this as well. Like I want to make sure people, I'm not like, okay, tell me about El Salvador and what is your view as the speaker for El Salvador, right? Like I
Yeah.
want to
Yeah. Of
get
course.
into this with a lot of different folks
Yep.
on the ground there. I'm super interested
Hmm.
based on my values. So when people are seeing headlines like this against Bukele, a bit against like, okay, Bukele is an authoritarian dictator, Bukele
Hmm.
is this, Bukele is that.
Hmm.
What are some of your thoughts about mainstream media doing that? And you can take and unpack that as you will.
Yeah, absolutely. My first thought is like, why do you care? Like, where was the concern,
Hmm.
30 years ago, right? 40 years ago, when
Yeah,
when this
yeah,
country got into a civil war because of U.S. involvement, because of U.S. support, for one
yeah.
side of that war. Where was the concern then? Where was the outcry, right? Um, so to me, the narrative, let's call it that, right? The narrative, the priorities, from left leaning media outlets in the U.S. Is
Hmm.
very clear. It's I think it's and again, remember, I experienced some of this negativity, right? The reputation of El Salvador was in the toilet, right, for so long, and I think it's easiest, I think, for a left-leaning kind of media apparatus, right, to maintain that level of skepticism and doubt, among an American audience about what's happening in El Salvador. From my vantage point,
Hmm.
I'm like, none of our opinions matter. The New York Times opinion doesn't matter. Yours doesn't matter. Mine doesn't matter. You know whose matter? The people of El Salvador's opinions matter.
Yep.
And I think
Yeah.
America, and in particular I think a left leaning America have this issue of like wanting to, we would say meter la cuchara, like, stick your fork in somebody else's food, and have an opinion. Like, it's like, we don't know not how not to
Yeah.
have an opinion. Just let, a country self-govern, which, by the way, is what's so inspiring to me about Bukele's approach, to this country, right? Is to say, we're going to become financially sovereign. We're going to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. We're going to, become Bitcoin country. What does that mean to you as an individual? It's about sovereignty, right? It's about freedom. That's what this country wants. It wants to be
Hmm.
left alone. And I think it's really hard for Western and left-leaning, media outlets and the apparatus that it supports to just let people do that, right? Because there's this kind of complex of savior complex, right? And we all know, and particularly now, we all know what that means. We all
Hmm.
know we don't want to be that, but we can't help it. Like, Americans seem to not be able to help it, to be like, no, but we're going to
Yeah.
fix it. Don't worry. We can do it. Our system of government is gonna, we know how to do it better, right? So listen to us, right? And I
Yeah.
think when you peel back, look under the hood of American democracy, if you're really, if you've been paying attention, you have to wonder, I'm sorry, like, yes, America has become this global, economic and political superpower by extorting and suppressing a lot of the folks that they want to support, suppress and take advantage of. So forgive me if I'm a little skeptical of the New York Times, narrative on this independent of this country who's wanting to be independent and sovereign. You know what I mean? So it's overall,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, that's kind of my takeaway. It's like, why do you care now? Why not just let a country govern itself, right? And be free to do so. And I think that's what El Salvador is really trying to do, in particular through Bitcoin adoption.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, and for those listening, I'm doing something new. For the YouTube watchers, you can see this. Starting to share some articles of what I'm talking about. So can you see this on your end, by the way?
I can. Yep.
So these are a couple of headlines. I've got New York Times on one, and then right now I'm showing The Economist. And the headlines are there. Let me put it this way: a lot of the headlines that I see around this topic, and many others around the world, but again, focusing on El Salvador, are condescending. Right? It's not an outright like, okay, this person is the worst or this is wrong. It is this headline is Nayib Bukele shows how to dismantle a democracy and stay popular. Right. So that's one. And honestly, the article is not much better in terms of the actual contents. Right. So a lot of
Mhm.
people lead with in these media outlets lead with like, okay, he's popular, the people like him. Okay, sure, but he's dismantling democracy. Right. So
Mhm.
that's kind of one approach. And this other that I want to show, the New York Times is a bit, I'd say, a bit more in the condescending realm with a very violent front image.
Mhm.
Um, so in El Salvador, the president cracks down on civil liberties and is beloved for it. So a similar sentiment
Mhm.
with this, and the subtext is much of the country's population is willing to tolerate an autocratic leader if it means that someone will finally solve their most pressing problem, gang violence. So
Mhm.
again, it's kind of the admission that, okay, there's a problem and they're willing to solve it, but at what cost? From a
Yep.
Western outlet that is not there, that is not
Mhm.
Salvadorian, that is not, like you said, coming from people on the ground. So again,
Mhm.
very complex situation.
Mhm.
Some things in the article might be worth discussing, but
Yeah.
again, the blanket statements of Western media outlets being very against anything
Mhm.
that is happening, any positive implications of this, they're saying, well, it goes against our trademarked code of democracy by the United States, or our
Right.
trademark of what we say is okay for other
Mhm.
nations, when we in the United States are so responsible for dismantling any sense of safety in these places, dismantling
Yeah.
democracies around the world.
Right.
So I think people from the left might understand the sense of, like, we talk about Iraq War, we talk about so many other dismantling of democracies for gain, for different things, for control, all of these different things. The same thing is
Eh,
happening here, and there's different nuances, obviously, but I want people to understand that context as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see what I'm showing, and for listeners, you can check out the video to see some of these graphics as well.
And Trey, if I can, sorry, interrupt there. Just as you mentioned, other wars and other efforts by the U.S. to bring democracy, its brand, by the way, of democracy, or bring its political,
Yeah.
system to countries that weren't asking for it, weren't clamoring for help or something like that. But America decides that you need the medicine that I'm giving you, right? And then
Yeah.
oftentimes that results in more dead bodies, more local strife,
Hmm.
not for the New York Times writer who gets to just write about it, but
Yeah.
not for the local folks in those nations, end up suffering collateral damage, and then um, and then oftentimes, and I'm not making a statement about what form of government is right or wrong. It's about sovereignty, right? And as
Hmm.
Bitcoiners, hopefully we
Yeah.
appreciate that. Hopefully we understand that, like, we all deserve sovereignty, personal, independent sovereignty, and then on a national
Hmm.
level, nations deserve sovereignty. Of course, we're a globally interconnected, community, so we need to be able to cooperate with one another. But I think this constant interjection, right, and constant narrative forming, right, in order to properly program American minds about El Salvador is really uh it's 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 counterproductive, right? It's
Hmm.
counterproductive, and it can be harmful. Just to take you quickly back to the history of El Salvador, that civil war that was fought, um, it began in 1979, and the reason that El Salvador became a proxy, and this should sound familiar, right? It became a proxy war between communist countries and and democracies, right? It was
Hmm.
perceived, that Russia was supporting the guerrilla, fighters, right, in the country. So what
Yeah.
does America have to do? Of course, you got to come back the other guy, right? But
Hmm.
and on the surface, and I think a lot of Bitcoiners have read these books, we understand that this stuff happens over and over in history. The net result of all of that, from the American interests, the superpowers, perspective, they're fat and happy in their hometowns, and then at the end of the bloody civil wars, you get to divide the spoils among the superpowers, and that's also what's a lot of what's happened in El Salvador as well. So these are
Hmm.
just sad consequences, I think, of a lot of interventionist tendencies from the U.S. government.
Yeah, and my point here is too, whether it's U.S. politicians in El Salvador, my point here isn't to praise or disregard or whatever a certain
Exactly.
politician. One of my points in having this conversation is like Western media on this and those that have clung to that are a bit hypocritical and without understanding a situation, just saying these things. So this isn't me saying Nayib Bukele is the greatest leader the world has ever seen, right? I'm not here to
Agreed.
make statements about that. I want to
Agreed.
be here to talk about and report what's happening on the ground with
Hmm.
actual people, because there's been so much of, wow, this is terrible for democracy, terrible for folks.
Hmm.
But then, I'm getting bits and pieces here and there where I can from my
Hmm.
US vantage point of certain families and certain people saying El Salvador is safer and we are able to actually visit again. We're able to see our family. We're able to run businesses. We're able to
Hmm.
feel like we own our lives again. So I'm hearing
Hmm.
those two things and I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, we should talk about this and unpack, because even this podcast, right, is a global podcast, but most of our listeners are in the U.S., Canada, Great Britain, and Germany. I think is fourth, surprisingly.
Hmm.
But in terms of obviously a lot of English speakers, a lot of Westerners. So I want to do what I can to try to amplify these messages from people that are sitting in cozy chairs in the U.S. or wherever,
Yeah.
to get a little bit of understanding when you
Yeah.
see headlines like this. And I know obviously Bitcoiners who are listening are already skeptical of New York Times, right? But a lot of the
Hmm.
folks that might be listening to our show in particular
Yeah.
might still be getting a lot of news from them, which is fine. I'm not saying disregard all of that. But what I am saying is they've been particularly harsh and crass against El Salvador and against some
Yeah.
things that are benefiting people's lives.
Hmm.
Again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like that, those first couple of layers are starting
Yeah.
to get better for people. And I think a
And
lot
I
of
think.
folks on the left too would be interested in hearing some of the things we're talking about in terms of like interventionism,
Hmm.
wars and promoting wars and proxy
Hmm.
wars. These are
Hmm.
stuff folks from the left, many still, but historically have definitely been against. And it is the
Yeah.
same recipe here.
And also, I would add to that, that as left leaning, folks in your audience, I would hope that there's a sensitivity to, uh, respect and mutual respect, right? Of course, with people, right? Hopefully with people from other
Hmm.
cultures and other contexts and other countries, um, and a almost a prioritization of listening to what you're doing here, what you're doing with your time, not just with me, of course, but with any Salvadoran, every Salvadoran that you speak to, and not just of the Bitcoiner, type, but of any Salvadoran. I think listening to local perspectives exclusively on a local topic is important, because we could interview
Hmm.
New York Times reporters or American folks who have not lived through any of this stuff, and our opinions don't matter on the subject. The opinions that matter are these. And
Hmm. Hmm.
if folks like yourself are doing this aggressively, there's a guy named Bitcoin Shooter on Twitter who has also done a lot to record and document a lot of these perspectives. That's what matters. And
Yeah.
like yourself, I'm not saying that all of the problems are solved and everyone has glowing reviews for El Salvador. That's not the point. Of course, of course there
Hmm.
are folks who have qualms and criticisms of the government, and those should be heard. But those should be heard,
Yeah.
not the
Yes.
voice of the Canadian or the American, journalist who has a humongous megaphone, right? And can influence public
Hmm.
perception on
Yeah.
a topic that they only know tangentially.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another thing we can transition to a little bit, because I know this one's been a little more particular, and I think it's getting better. And again, this is just from my vantage point. I will have to say one little aside that I want to mention, because this is another background we share in terms of
Mhm,
our religious upbringing and my evangelical upbringing, and I think yours as well in the states at least.
mhm,
My context of El Salvador was actually through, and this is something I've talked here about a little openly, many people offline as well. Growing up evangelical, and I just was talking to Anita Posh yesterday about this actually in terms of like a missionary worldview, and this is
mhm,
kind of goes along with American exceptionalism and that sort of thing. But so I had gone down to do missions work in high school in Guatemala,
mhm,
and that's something that, again, I was a kid understanding this, but regret a lot of that and a lot of the ways that we approached it. Going into, okay, we're here to fix the situation in 1 week. See you later. Never
mhm,
see you again, type thing. So not necessarily to unpack that, but um, one thing that we did is I had a layover in the airport in El Salvador a couple of times, and this was probably 2006, 2007. And I do remember it is interesting in terms of the way we viewed it, but just even that experience then at that time, which is I know remarkably different even than today. In terms of there were many prisoners being shuttled through of what you said,
mhm,
gang members, like
mhm,
actively while
mhm,
we were there from the states.
mhm,
But the police presence and drug presence was very palpable.
mhm,
The guards there was very palpable. Everything, the energy of it was exactly what you're describing. And so for me, not even knowing an ounce of personally what you're describing, I remember those airport encounters. And
mhm,
if that kind of translates to on the ground, what people were experiencing. And I saw a lot of local families as well traveling
mhm,
between the states. It was
mhm.
palpable there.
Yep.
And it's not that Guatemala was in a bit of a better state at the time, but it was very different. And it was
Yeah.
known that
Mhm,
that El Salvador, there were not many people that looked like me in that airport
mhm.
at the
Yeah.
time in those days.
Yeah.
Now there are. Take that what you will,
Mhm.
but like you said, tourism is back. All these other things are back, which can be
Yeah.
good. So I
And
wanted
actually,
to add
just a
that
quick
tangent to it as well. But
Yeah, no, and just
yeah.
a quick point on that, actually, on airports, by the way, or the international airport here in San Salvador. I noted the same thing, to my wife and kids when we started to come more frequently. I'm like, this place was littered with military personnel with M16s everywhere, right around every corner. You got a
Hmm.
sense back then that you were landing in a country that was either at war or where your personal safety was not guaranteed. So there needed to be all this police presence everywhere, right? Or military presence everywhere. And
Yeah.
nowadays you walk out, first of all, there's a new international terminal at the airport. So you
Yeah,
walk
I've
into
seen
this
that.
thing
Yeah.
that's absolutely beautiful and feels like what you're accustomed to in the US in terms of airport travel, right? You walk all the
Hmm.
way outside, and then there's finally one security guy with a little pistol on his hip. But in terms of the signal that that sends you, in terms of the safety that you should expect, I think it's a night and day shift.
Yeah, for sure. And I
Mhm,
do think one of the thing that's, I mean, all of the situation is complex that we're talking about, and for folks listening, and I'll be sure to try to throw out like some of the folks you mentioned, like other people to
mhm,
follow that are on the ground day in and day out,
mhm,
in El
mhm,
Salvador, to follow these people, track what's going on, read
mhm,
different and better news sources. I'll make sure to track all of
mhm.
that. Like someone shouldn't listen to this episode and think, okay, I'm all set on
No,
understanding the
exactly.
situation, right? So these are
Yep.
these are always starting points for people, whether I'm
Mhm,
talking to you, whether it's talking to Anita or Farida
mhm,
or others. But one thing I'll say too that some people have highlighted in a good way is Bitcoin adoption. So one of the
mhm,
more controversial takes I would say is making Bitcoin legal tender kind of overnight in terms of
mhm,
some folks knew the announcement was coming, some folks knew the decision was coming, but folks being required to accept Bitcoin, right? If they're small businesses, being legal tender, things like that. So that's something that some people would say was a bit more controversial of a decision in
mhm.
terms of this.
Yep.
But I will say what I've seen is the Bitcoin education going through the roof with so many different
Mhm.
groups over the past years. Well, what are some of your takeaways from this? Seeing Bitcoin adoption, seeing folks use and interact with it. What are some of your thoughts on Bitcoin adoption, some of these decisions, and things like that?
Look, I think in a nutshell, Bitcoin adoption it went from non-existent, right, to a meaningful portion. I think a recent survey came out about maybe it's not super recent, but about a year ago, a survey of Salvadorans came out noting that about 24% of the population acknowledges that Bitcoin has improved their lives in some capacity. Now, the article that came from was meant to be critical of like, oh, look, only 24% of the country, you know, thinks Bitcoin's a good thing. And I'm like, I'm sorry, 24% of this country actually feel a positive impact from a place of 0%, 2 years ago to now. I think the expectation oftentimes is like, well, why isn't everybody using Bitcoin? It's like, I'm sorry, not none of your friends know how to use Bitcoin in Boston. I don't mean you specifically, but none of
Yeah,
your American friends in
yeah, yeah,
Minneapolis know how to
100%.
use Bitcoin. So the fact
Hmm.
that the adoption, has happened at whatever rate it has here is remarkable. And to your point, I think a lot of that has to do with some of the nonprofit and private groups that have hired folks and are that are bootstrapped and educating on a weekly basis in high schools in El Salvador. I think that is absolutely game changing for
Hmm.
the future of this country. That is planting seeds today that are going to give fruit in the future, right? There's both private, efforts around this, like Mi Primer Bitcoin, which is a formal, literal
Hmm.
curriculum written in Spanish and translated to other languages that's getting taught in high schools across the country. And then there's also government supported programs like Google Plus, which is a
Hmm.
Lightning Developers like Academy. Right. So here you take,
Yeah.
computer science students and professionals and deep dive them into, Bitcoin and Lightning developer courses with people like Giacomo and Jimmy Song. It's amazing that these things are happening in this
Hmm.
country and they're happening nowhere else. So to your question about, Bitcoin adoption, is every store around the country using Bitcoin? No, absolutely not. Right? That's definitely not the
Hmm.
case. And I think
Yep.
that in particular, in the middle of a bear market, it's obviously harder for people to come around. People at that base layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs to be like, yeah, no, I'm going to put a little savings away.
Hmm.
Like, no, these folks are
Sure.
working for today, right? However, I will tell you, as a family who sends remittances to El Salvador, my family is fully like let's call it, we're vertically integrated now in terms of the way that we send money to El Salvador. Nobody uses money transmitting services in my
Hmm.
family anymore. Nobody wastes time going to a bank branch. Like we all can, we've all everyone has learned how to
Yeah.
transact, you know, without much costs and pretty instantly over the Bitcoin network. So while that is not indicative of an entire nation, I think it's indicative of a direction, right, that the country is heading in.
Yeah, and if you compare that to any poll work that's done in the US, like you said, like 24% or something like that, and there's a lot of other studies with different words, but the way that one's worded, and at 24% with just a few years beginning adoption, right? Given the
Hmm.
fact that
Hmm.
Bitcoin itself is also only 14 years old on top of
Hmm.
that, that is incredible. I
Yeah, it
mean,
is.
incredible
It is.
progress and understanding. And what gives me hope, you mentioned Me Premier Bitcoin, and shout out to them. And Max DeMarco made like a great accessible video for them
Hmm.
that really well done, really professional, high quality, like 20-minute videos. And Max has been putting out incredible videos just highlighting these things. I think for anyone, but also just for someone from the West to spark their
Hmm.
curiosity, to be like, oh,
Yeah.
what's going on? What's going on here? Like, does a good mix of like interviewing some people that are like, oh yeah, we're accepting Bitcoin, and like, I don't know if I really know how to use it, and then showing like education. So it's not just it's a very positive film, but it also feels real and tangible. Like he's talking
Right.
with people on the ground and highlighting Me Premier Bitcoin. And that's one of the things when I first reached out to you about a year ago, just talking about like, especially these Salvadorian students in Chelsea that I had been working at with my previous job, thinking
Hmm.
about how Bitcoin education could transform their remittances, transform their understanding of money, their understanding of their history and background, because a lot of students and even friends of mine from El Salvador, but also other places, had the same experience as you. Where and just hearing
Hmm.
you say that, I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like my friend who mentions like it took me a long time to be okay with
Hmm.
my heritage or not
Hmm.
try to just whitewash that or just kind of
Hmm.
erase that because I'm kind of embarrassed by it or I'm kind of like
Yep.
not crazy about it because of their own personal bullying experiences. So that hits
Hmm.
home for I bet so many people listening to this right now
Absolutely.
in
Hmm.
particular. But seeing that Bitcoin education, right? And seeing
Hmm.
this curriculum is no joke. And I come from the world and you do as well with like education
Hmm.
curriculum, nonprofit curriculums. It's really good and tight. Like it does
Hmm.
a
It
great
is.
job. And
It
these
is.
young people are the ones that, yes, they're helping support their families at home. Yes, they're paying bills alongside their families, but they're also the ones that like, let me take 5% and put that in Bitcoin. Let me
Yep.
use Bitcoin. Some students are like, it's fun. It's fun to
Yeah.
use. It's cool to use. Like these young people, those are the tomorrow of El
Yeah.
Salvador. So that
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
left me feeling
Exactly.
so, the term goes, bullish on Bitcoin,
Hmm.
bullish on El Salvador and the global South, regardless of what people in the US think about it, to be honest.
Exactly. And I came across something the other day with a one of the graduates of the Google Plus program, the Lightning and Lightning Development Academy that was launched. And I thought it's so interesting because I think another thing that's happening that's going to, and we're going to continue to see in El Salvador is a bit of a network effect, right? As as the first
Mhm.
companies come down here and hire Salvadorans to do, to do whatever type of work, Fold is down here, Strike is down here. There's going to be more and more companies. I mean, Primera Bitcoin, of course, as a nonprofit, employs folks. What's happening is there's starting to be a bit of a network effect. I saw on Twitter a young man who graduated from Google Plus shared a screenshot of what a young, I believe, high schooler shared with him about just being thankful that he was pouring into the high schooler when he himself has
Mhm.
just been poured into, right? So there's this kind of network effect that I think El Salvador is going to be. We talk a lot about, or we use the term first mover advantage, right? I think this is precisely where
Mhm.
the first mover advantage in terms of national adoption really will be seen, right? In particular, because this
Yeah.
pouring into is happening with a lot of young people, and then they're turning around and educating younger folks than them. So to me, that makes me wildly
Mhm.
bullish on El Salvador's future.
Yeah, and yeah, I love conversations like this because also what I hit home, and I probably say almost every episode, is like Bitcoin is not the end, right? The
Hmm.
reason folks started looking to Bitcoin or seeing like all the things we just discussed, we probably talked 95% of the time on other things besides
Hmm.
Bitcoin. It's like Bitcoin is kind of
Yeah.
the tool and the catalyst for a lot of this change, business
Yep.
expansion, more
Hmm.
self sovereignty, property ownership, safety, all of this. Like Bitcoin can kind of bring about that. It opens a door and then you
Yep.
keep going past that. But the principles of
Hmm.
what we're talking about is like people just wanting better lives for them and their family and hope for the future in a way that I can't understand. And the only way I try to I got lucky enough to try to get into Bitcoin a few years back to start listening to stories and be like, how can I help? And I think
Yeah.
if you're in a position where you're not in these places, just think who can you connect with, whatever you're doing, whatever work environment you're in, whatever profession. If you have some money and some sats to give, whatever position you're in, just ask yourself, how can you help? Reach out to
Yep.
folks in DMs. That's how I got started. That's how I
Hmm.
messaged you.
Hmm.
That's how I've messaged
Yeah.
so many people coming on this podcast, or so many
Hmm.
groups that I message and say, hey, how can I help? This is my background. This is what I do.
Yep.
What can we do to help? That is what
And
people in the West can do today.
exactly, I agree, and I think that's a great note to, or kind of call to action, I think, to your audience, and to use some of the parlance and language that I think we're probably used to. I would encourage folks to elevate voices of Salvadorans upon hearing, whether it's a story,
Hmm.
whether it's a whether you're a business owner and you end up connecting with Salvadorans in some capacity. Use your platform or your voice or your privilege to amplify the voices of Salvadorans who are now the world is curious about, right? But rather than making ourselves the center
Yeah,
of those things, we should use these platforms and these opportunities we have to elevate the voices of the folks who are having these experiences down here, the good and the bad, right? All of it is important in order
yeah.
to, for the rest of the world to have an accurate accounting of what's happening here, not the, the desired narrative of like larger, apparatuses or whatnot.
And I want to make sure too to get into with you a little bit about Bitcoin mining and your interest there,
Hmm.
because I know that's probably the same, if not your second love, is Bitcoin mining. So, can you talk to
Yeah.
people a little bit about what you've been doing on the mining side of things?
Sure, sure, yeah. So I started to let me begin by why I decided to mine Bitcoin. So I went super deep down the rabbit hole. I became a person who
Mm,
really saw Bitcoin, and storing my wealth in Bitcoin, storing my saving in Bitcoin, as a way to opt out of the uh, that this system, system in the U.S. in particular, where in particular as a nonprofit person at the time, I was never going to be able to disconnect from needing money from cantillionaires. Right, in the nonprofit world, we have to ask for money from people
mhm,
who are wealthy because of the cantillionaire effect. And I'm like, I don't want to live my life like that ever again. So if I save in Bitcoin, I already save in Bitcoin, and we all know we don't want to we don't want to risk our Bitcoin capital, right, on just anything, right? But we have to think very carefully what we spend our Bitcoin on, what we risk it on. I said the only thing that I'm willing to risk my Bitcoin on is the production or generation of more Bitcoin, right? And I
mhm,
didn't know anything about mining. I don't come from an engineering background. I come from a capital markets background. So I started to dabble, right? I started to buy some ASICs, and of course, since I don't own my own, energy source, I had to pay. I had to what's called, pay a hosting fee to someone who would sell me electricity, right? And manage my machines. What I realized is that this is a rabbit hole that I wanted to go down, right? So this is
mm,
2019, going into 2020. And I decided to start to invest more of my Bitcoin savings in Bitcoin, mining machines. I got to an allocation that I was comfortable with, and I decided then to make this the way that I put food on the table for my family, right? So that I can, because as Bitcoiners, I think hopefully we value time the most, right? Time is the thing you
mhm,
can't get back. Time is the thing you don't know how much you have, right? So I've really focused my life around optimizing for time, freedom over my time. So
mhm,
these are the reasons kind of why I got into Bitcoin mining. Um, I established a small Bitcoin mining business in America. It's domiciled in America, but I have assets in a couple of different continents for diversification purposes, um, and it's allowed me to live a life that where I can spend a lot of time with my young children who need me right now, right? Now, as a Salvadoran, you can imagine my elation in 2021 when this country, of all countries, decided to, make Bitcoin legal tender. And immediately in my head, I was like, wow, I have to be, I have to do whatever I can to support the proliferation of this, asset in this country, but also when it comes to mining, because the president very famously said we were going to turn on volcanoes and generate more energy through these
Hmm.
volcanoes. I said I want to do whatever I can to support those efforts as well. So, over the past couple of years, I've had the privilege of serving on in the National Bitcoin Office, being an advisor to the Digital Securities Commission here in El Salvador, um, working with Max and Stacy on a lot of like the energy related issues that are being trying to be developed here, because energy also, right, is not just not only Bitcoin, but energy is what uh, life flourishes on, right? So I've tried to use
Hmm.
whatever assets I can bring to the table, whatever competencies I can bring to the table to help El Salvador, go on a path of energy and financial independence, right? And I'm on that
Hmm.
journey,
Hmm.
so I'm very happy. I have a amazing family, amazing two little girls who I get to spend a lot of time with. But I'm also, eager to contribute and eager to be a part of this intersection between Bitcoin mining and El Salvador. Wherever that goes, I'm on the journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think too, you mentioned his name, and I meant to say this early on in our conversation when you were talking about work and the pace of life in certain environments,
Hmm.
especially El Zonte and other places in El
Hmm.
Salvador now. Jimmy Song had put out, it was either a tweet or a post a couple of days before the time of recording, talking about work and talking about things a lot of people have been talking about for a while, but just saying how much focus and attention we put into how much work we're doing, how productive we're being in terms of time, like
Hmm.
time lost, if you will, in
Hmm.
American workplaces, in how busy your work weeks are, in how
Hmm.
little time you spend with your family, but you're successful at your business or whatever the case may be. And what is cool to see is like there are many Bitcoiners that I might disagree with politically, views wise, things like this. But something that I think a lot of Bitcoiners agree on
Hmm.
is this time preference. And we talk about that
Yep.
word all the time, like low time preference and
Yep.
using your time wisely. So
Hmm.
not mattering like how many hours in a week can I work or can I do this thing that is a hamster
Yep.
wheel that we've grown towards.
Yep.
But hearing you say that and just, seeing you and being like, man, that is an ideal for how, to be honest with you, like I would want to be as a father, or just the way that you're pouring love and attention into your kids and family the way you do, understanding the background you had too, which I know is there for you, which is like
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
way you were working in New York, the way you were working in
Right.
capital markets, the way you were on Wall
Yeah.
Street. That
Hmm.
grind is probably a huge motivation for you. I don't think it's probably what
Absolutely.
kept you going. I think a lot of it is just your values in general.
Hmm.
But that is just
Yeah.
a beautiful thing to see. And Jimmy Song highlighted that. It's like we're obsessed with work, and this time is a Bitcoiner, and I think hopefully a lot of people, our most precious asset at the end of this, and valuing that time with family is a really important message to push along as Bitcoiners, and to say it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be this way. Um,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
trying to make that a better reality for people. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I agree. I agree. I think all at the end of the day, Bitcoin should give us freedom over our time. Not freedom to spend on stuff, but freedom to live our lives in the moment and fully pour into the people that are important
Mhm.
to us, right? Because we really don't know how long we are here on this earth, right? So we got to kind of make the most of the time that we have, and do good, right? Like I said, it was kind of the reason I got into nonprofit work, but I'm so grateful that I found Bitcoin because I think it's a way higher and better use of my time in order to make a positive difference in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I got to that place as well, and I'm feeling the same way. So, in closing here, one thing I want to ask is,
Yeah.
when you're looking to El Salvador, looking to the global South, what are some of the things that excite you most when you look out a year, 2 years, 5 years?
Mhm.
Thinking about the groundwork that's being laid through Bitcoin and other initiatives, what are some of the things you're most excited to see, and some of the things that you think are most replicable into other environments?
Um, I mean, the most exciting thing to me is, I guess, um, to see the national kind of uh, the reputation of this country continue to build globally, right? I think there are so many places around the world where we can see, and not everybody has, of course, the same opinion, but there's some places that objectively everyone looks at and says, wow, those, these societies, these communities, these countries have their stuff together. I'm really excited to see El Salvador kind of elevate itself on a sovereign basis, right? On a sound money, on the basis of sound money, bring itself up out of this place of reputational just muck for so long. That on a personal level, that's important to me because of my own experiences as a kid, right? Secondly, I hope that the world understands just how incredible the people of El Salvador are. They always have been, but no one's been paying attention for so long. And now that everyone's paying attention, I'm excited to see Salvadorans build technology companies, build energy companies, build products and services that other people in the world can use, right? So I'm excited to see the economy of El Salvador thrive at a GDP level, but also at the local level, right? For folks that have only known survival, that have only known I got to go work so we can eat. Got to go work so we can eat. I'm excited to see these folks kind of lift themselves out of the circumstances that have been laid upon them for decades. So generally speaking, that's what I would say. I'm excited for the people of El Salvador.
Awesome. That's super exciting. And if you had to, have people anywhere they can follow you, what are some also, and I'll put some in the show notes and other conversations we have too, but for people to get a better understanding of a lot of the things we talked about, a lot of the groups doing important work, and I'll make sure we chat offline as well if there's others you want to throw out there, but what are some places you would direct people to continue exploring this?
For sure. So I'm on Twitter at Gerson Martinez, Gerson Martinez. I'm on Twitter. I like to share a lot of try to kind of elevate a lot of what's happening in El Salvador in terms of educational initiatives. Obviously, education is an important thing. I think globally for in general. I like to support, and I would love for people to follow Mi Primer Bitcoin, which is their Twitter handle is actually in English. It's at My First Bitcoin. The educational program we talked about. I would also recommend you follow Google Plus, at Google Plus SV, I believe, on Twitter. And also, I think with respect to the national kind of policies around that impact Bitcoin adoption, I would encourage you to follow the National Bitcoin Office Twitter account as well. I think it's at Bitcoin Office SV. So that'll keep people aware of what's happening at an official kind of federal level here in El Salvador. Also follow Bitcoin Beach and also the building that I'm in right now, Hope House. At Hope House this is a community a project, community kind of nonprofit project. It's here for the benefit of the community. I'm sitting in a co-working space in El Zonte, which is phenomenal that these resources are here. So if you want to be aware of what's happening at Bitcoin Beach specifically, those are some places to go as well.
Yeah, awesome. And if anyone has the privilege, go visit. Even if you want to go on a beautiful vacation and just have fun, go visit, go support this local economy, support these Bitcoin projects, and get in touch. But Gerson, thank you so much for this conversation. Best to you and your family. Keep enjoying your vacation down there. I know you're doing some work too, but enjoy your time down there, man. And thank you so much for jumping on today.
Thank you very much, Trey. I really appreciate it.